Adil woke up that morning feeling unusually calm. The sun was just beginning to filter through the curtains of his small apartment, casting a soft, warm light across the room. He stretched and yawned, thinking about the day ahead. It was an ordinary day, at least on the surface, but he enjoyed ordinary days. They gave him a sense of peace he rarely found anywhere else. He prepared his breakfast slowly, savoring the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and took a moment to glance out the window. At the quiet street below, people were already moving, children running to school, and a few neighbors tending to their gardens. Life went on around him, and he felt content just being a small part of it. By mid-morning, Adil decided to leave for his usual routine. He liked visiting a local cafe near his office, not for the fancy drinks or the food, but for the calm atmosphere. The cafe was a small, cozy place with wooden tables, soft lighting, and a few potted plants that added color to the warm brown and cream. Interior: it was the kind of place where people could sit quietly with their thoughts or enjoy small conversations without interruption. Adil liked to find a corner seat near the window where he could watch the world outside while sipping his favorite, coffee. As he entered the cafe, the familiar smell of coffee and fresh pastries immediately made him feel relaxed. The soft hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of cups created a comforting background. Adil moved to the counter, greeted the barista with a polite nod, and placed his order. As he waited, he noticed the usual mix of customers, some working on laptops, others chatting with friends. It was a normal day in every way, and yet it was the kind of normal that made him appreciate the small joys of life. While standing in line, Adil became aware of a woman behind him. She seemed impatient, tapping her foot lightly and checking her phone repeatedly. Her eyes met his briefly, and in that moment, there was an unspoken tension. Adil had learned over the years that people often projected their frustrations onto others without realizing it. He could sense that she was in a bad mood, but he had no intention of letting it affect him. He continued to wait quietly, keeping his expression neutral and his mind calm. Suddenly, without any clear reason, the woman spoke. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the soft ambient noise of the cafe. "Excuse me? Are you blind? Or do you just like cutting in line?" she asked, her tone full of irritation. Adil turned slightly toward her and gave a small, polite smile. "I'm sorry if it seemed that way," he replied softly. "I've been waiting here quietly." He didn't raise his voice or show any sign of anger. He simply responded with calmness, which seemed to confuse her for a moment. Most people, he knew, expected confrontation or a defensive response, and his quiet demeanor did not fit her expectations. The woman's expression hardened. She was used to people reacting to her words, either with anger or apology, and this lack of response made her uneasy. She leaned slightly forward and said, "Don't give me that polite nonsense. You saw me, you just ignored me." Adil remained. Still, his body relaxed and his eyes calm. Inside, he felt a slight twinge of curiosity. He wondered why some people felt the need to attack others over nothing. He had seen this many times in his life. People carried their frustrations like heavy bags and sometimes dropped them on others. He chose not to pick up those bags. Instead of responding further, Adil moved to the side and waited for his turn to order. He focused on the counter, on the menu, on the pleasant aroma of coffee. He reminded himself that his peace was more important than winning an argument. The woman behind him muttered something under her breath, clearly annoyed that he had not reacted the way she expected. He ignored it. Each moment he remained calm, he felt a small sense of strength, not in proving her wrong, but in preserving his own peace. When it was finally his turn to order, Adil spoke softly to the barista, asking for his usual coffee. The barista, familiar with him, smiled and began preparing the drink. As the woman continued to make small, sharp comments, some of the other customers began to notice. A few glanced over, curious about the tension, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the conflict brewing in their midst. Adil noticed the glances but didn't let them affect him. He had learned that the opinions of strangers were not worth disturbing his calm. Finally, the barista handed him his coffee. Adil thanked her with the same quiet politeness that defined his character. He picked up his cup and moved to his favorite corner seat by the window. From this vantage point, he could watch the world outside, see the movement of people, the play of sunlight, and the small joys of life that often went unnoticed. As he sat down, he took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth fill him with comfort. He was not angry, nor was he upset. He simply existed in the moment, content and aware. The woman, seeing that her words had no effect, seemed momentarily stunned. She had expected a reaction, an argument, a defense, or even a simple acknowledgement of her anger. Instead, she found nothing but calm and patience. This made her pause. Adil, meanwhile, continued to enjoy his coffee, watching life go by without letting negativity touch him. It was a small moment, but it was a perfect example of his philosophy, that peace comes not from controlling others, but from controlling oneself. By the time he finished his coffee, Adil felt ready to continue his day. He had faced unexpected irritation with calmness and had preserved his own sense of dignity. For him, this ordinary morning had become a small lesson in patience, in the quiet strength of composure, and in the art of remaining unaffected by the unnecessary anger of others. After finishing his coffee, Adil felt a quiet satisfaction. There was something calming about knowing that he could remain composed even when faced with unexpected hostility. He stood up, paid the barista, and tucked his wallet back into his pocket. The cafe was still lively, the chatter of other customers filling the room, but a subtle tension lingered in the air because of the woman who had been so outspoken moments before. She watched him with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Her expectation had been to provoke him, to see some kind of reaction, but Adil had shown none. This confused her, and the confusion slowly shifted into irritation. The woman, Maya, had always been outspoken. She had a sharp tongue and a tendency to speak without filtering her thoughts. It had served her in some situations, allowing her to get what she wanted or make her presence felt. But in this moment, she faced someone entirely different, someone who refused to engage in negativity. She muttered to herself, clearly angry that her usual tactics were not working. Her eyes followed Adil as he moved to his favorite corner, sitting calmly with his coffee, paying no attention to her words. Adil, sensing the woman's continued irritation, remained completely relaxed. He knew from experience that some people could not control their emotions and felt the need to release them on others. He also knew that reacting to such people rarely solved anything. It only added fuel to their frustration. So he chose the path of quiet observation. From his seat, he could see the movement of the cafe, notice small details, the way sunlight reflected off the windows, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the careful arrangement of pastries on display. These small things grounded him, keeping him focused on the present rather than the negativity around him. Maya, growing more frustrated by his calmness, decided to escalate. She leaned slightly forward and spoke loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "Seriously, do you always act like nothing bothers you, or are you just pretending to be important?" Her words were sharp, intended to shame him or provoke a reaction. The surrounding people glanced over, curious about the interaction, sensing that something unusual was happening. Many of them had seen arguments flare up in cafes before, but rarely had anyone faced such open aggression with total composure. Adil looked at her quietly, his expression neutral. He did not raise his voice, he did not argue, and he did not show any sign of irritation. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth of the cup steady his mind. Inside, he reflected on the philosophy he had cultivated over the years. Life was too short to waste energy on anger or retaliation. People could say unkind things, but that did not have to determine his mood or sense of self. His calmness was not weakness. It was strength. Maya, seeing that her attempts to provoke him were ineffective, tried another approach. She began making personal comments about his appearance, questioning the way he dressed and even implying that he looked uninteresting or dull. These words, though harsh, still had no effect on Adil. He simply continued to sit quietly, maintaining eye contact only when necessary and focusing mostly on his own sense of peace. He realized that her words revealed more about her own frustrations and insecurities than they did about him. The other customers began to notice the dynamic between them. Some exchanged quiet whispers, impressed by Adil's ability to remain calm. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the tension but unable to ignore it. A few even felt a small sense of admiration for him, realizing that patience and composure were far more powerful than any heated argument. Adil, for his part, did not seek recognition. He simply observed, appreciating the lesson that life often presented in subtle ways. Maya, growing increasingly frustrated, leaned closer and continued to speak, raising her voice slightly. "Why are you acting like this doesn't bother you? Don't you care what people think?" Her words were meant to unsettle him, but Adil remained unshaken. He thought to himself that it was curious how some people could not understand the concept of self-control. To them, anger and frustration seemed like natural responses, but to him, they were unnecessary burdens. By refusing to carry those burdens, he preserved his sense of dignity and inner peace. As the situation continued, Adil took another sip of coffee and glanced out the window. Outside, life went on. The city moved at its usual pace. People walked with purpose, and the sunlight shifted gradually across the streets. The contrast between the calm of the outside world and the tension inside the cafe was striking. He realized that most conflicts were like that, temporary, often unnecessary disturbances in the flow of life. Choosing not to engage in them allowed one to maintain clarity and perspective. After a few more moments, it became clear that Maya's efforts were failing. Her frustration was visible, her posture tense, her expression tight. Adil, however, remained relaxed. He did not feel a need to respond, to justify himself, or to engage in argument. He understood that some people could not accept silence as an answer, but that was their challenge, not his. By remaining calm, he communicated something far more powerful than words ever could. That dignity, patience, and self-control held far more value than anger or provocation. Finally, the moment reached a quiet peak. Adil finished his coffee slowly, savoring each sip, and prepared to leave. He stood up with the same quiet confidence he had carried throughout the encounter. Maya, now fully aware that she had failed to provoke any reaction, looked at him with a mix of shock and curiosity. For a moment there was silence between them, a silence filled with unspoken understanding that the usual rules of confrontation did not apply here. Adil walked toward the counter to thank the barista one more time, and then moved toward the door. Each step he took was calm and measured, reflecting the inner strength he had maintained throughout the encounter. He did not look back, and he did not say a word to Maya. She watched him leave, her frustration mixed with a strange sense of awe. She had expected anger or defensiveness, but instead, she witnessed calmness, patience, and quiet dignity, qualities she realized she had rarely encountered before. As he stepped out into the sunlight, Adil felt a gentle sense of relief. He had faced unexpected hostility with grace and composure. The encounter, though brief, was a reminder of the power of restraint and the importance of keeping one's inner peace intact. He continued down the street, moving through life with the same quiet confidence that had guided him for years, knowing that sometimes the most powerful response to negativity is simply to remain unshaken and to continue forward with calm determination. After leaving the cafe, Adil continued down the busy city street, carrying with him the calm he had preserved during the earlier encounter. The sunlight reflected gently off the windows of nearby shops, and the hum of traffic mixed with distant conversations created a comforting background noise. He walked slowly, observing the world around him, the children playing on the sidewalks, the shopkeepers arranging their displays, and the occasional bird darting across the sky. Each small detail reminded him that life moved on, regardless of the brief tension he had experienced minutes ago. Meanwhile, back inside the cafe, Maya was still standing near her table, her arms crossed, her brow furrowed. She had expected an argument, a confrontation, or at least some kind of visible reaction from Adil. Instead, all she had received was calmness. This was unfamiliar territory for her, and it left her feeling unsettled. She glanced around, noticing the subtle reactions of other customers. Some were whispering to each other, exchanging glances that suggested admiration or surprise. Others avoided eye contact, unsure how to react to what they had witnessed. Maya realized, slowly, that her usual strategies of provocation had failed. Her frustration grew. She had always believed that speaking boldly and sharply was a way to assert control or make her presence felt. Yet here was someone who had simply refused to engage, someone who had walked away without conflict or anger. It was as if her words had bounced off an invisible shield, leaving no mark. This thought both irritated and intrigued her. She leaned back slightly, folding her arms tighter, and muttered under her breath, "How can someone be so calm?" Adil, on his walk, reflected on the encounter as well. He knew that some people would be surprised by his calmness. Most had been conditioned to expect reactions, to see arguments escalate, or to witness anger mirrored back at them. Yet he had chosen a different path, a path of quiet strength, self-control, and dignity. He understood that his response, or lack of it, was not just about the cafe encounter. It was about life in general, about choosing peace over conflict, and composure over reaction. As he turned a corner, he noticed a small park bathed in sunlight. Children were laughing as they ran across the grass. Parents were sitting on benches chatting, and an elderly man was feeding birds near a fountain. Adil paused for a moment, letting the scene fill him with a sense of calm. Life had a rhythm, a natural order, and small moments like these reminded him that negativity and anger were temporary disturbances in an otherwise peaceful flow. Back at the cafe, Maya decided she would not leave things as they were. She approached the counter and asked the barista quietly if they had seen the man who had been so calm. The barista, smiling, nodded and said he had left a few minutes ago. Maya returned to her table, frustrated that the encounter had ended without the reaction she wanted. She sat down, still fuming internally, but at the same time, there was a part of her mind that could not ignore what she had witnessed. She realized that something about Adil's behavior had made a lasting impression, even if she did not yet understand it fully. Adil, meanwhile, continued his walk through the city streets. He passed by small shops, noticing the details of everyday life, the way the light hit a colorful display of fruits, the gentle chatter of shopkeepers greeting customers, and the quiet determination in the faces of people going about their day. Each scene reminded him that life was a series of moments, and that negativity could only touch him if he allowed it to. He felt grateful for his ability to remain composed, even when confronted with aggression. As the day progressed, Adil decided to visit a bookstore he often frequented. He liked the quiet corners filled with books, the smell of paper, and the comforting atmosphere where thoughts could flow freely. Walking through the aisles, he reflected on the encounter in the cafe. He realized that the woman's anger had more to do with her own frustrations than with him. People often projected their insecurities and dissatisfaction onto others, and the most powerful response was not to fight back, but to remain calm and unaffected. Back in the cafe, Maya finally left, still thinking about the calm man she had encountered. She walked slowly through the city streets, her mind buzzing with questions. Why had he not reacted? Why had he walked away? For the first time in a long while, she wondered if she had been wrong in believing that forceful words always held power. She felt a strange mix of frustration and curiosity, a sense that she had learned something important without even realizing it. Adil, now seated in a quiet corner of the bookstore, picked up a book and allowed himself to be absorbed in its pages. The encounter at the cafe had passed, but its lessons lingered in his mind. He thought about how often people allowed anger and frustration to dictate their actions, and how rare it was to see someone maintain true composure. He felt a quiet sense of pride, not in having won an argument, but in having preserved his own peace and dignity. Meanwhile, Maya continued her walk, reflecting more deeply on her behavior. She realized that shouting and insults could create temporary satisfaction, but they rarely left a lasting impression. In contrast, the calm, quiet approach of the man at the cafe had stayed with her, making her rethink how she dealt with conflicts in her own life. She noticed a subtle change within herself, a willingness to consider restraint and thoughtfulness instead of immediate reaction. As the afternoon sun began to lower in the sky, both Adil and Maya moved through the city streets, each carrying their own reflections. Adil felt the steady confidence of someone who knew the power of patience and inner peace. Maya, on the other hand, felt the beginnings of a lesson slowly taking root, one that would stay with her longer than she could yet imagine. By the time evening approached, the day had passed without further incident. Adil returned to his apartment, feeling a deep sense of calm and satisfaction. He had faced hostility without anger, maintained his dignity, and continued his day without letting negativity interfere. Maya, in her own way, had also experienced growth, as the encounter had planted seeds of thoughtfulness and self-awareness. The city settled into the quiet rhythm of evening, with lights beginning to glow in shop windows and cars moving steadily through the streets. Life went on, full of small moments and lessons that often went unnoticed. Adil and Maya, though moving in separate paths, had both been shaped by a brief encounter in a cafe. One had maintained calm, the other had begun to reflect. And sometimes it was in these small, unremarkable moments that the most powerful lessons in life were learned. Adil returned to his apartment in the late afternoon, feeling the familiar comfort of home. The soft light of the setting sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room. He placed his coat and bag carefully on the rack and made himself a cup of tea. As he sat by the window, he reflected on the events of the day, particularly the encounter at the cafe. What had started as an ordinary morning had turned into a small test of his patience and self-control. Yet despite the tension, he had remained composed, calm, and fully in control of his emotions. The more he thought about it, the more he appreciated the quiet power of restraint. Meanwhile, Maya was walking through the city streets, still thinking about the calm man she had confronted. She had expected a fight, a harsh response, or at least visible irritation from him, but all she had received was silence and composure, a complete refusal to engage in negativity. At first, she had felt frustrated and even humiliated, but now, hours later, she felt a strange curiosity taking hold. Why had he not reacted? Why had he chosen to leave rather than argue? For the first time, she began to realize that confrontation and aggression were not always the most effective ways to deal with others. As Adil sat in his apartment, he reflected on what had occurred. He considered how often people allowed themselves to be consumed by anger or frustration, Many spent their days reacting to insults, criticism, or minor slights, forgetting that they had the power to choose their own response. Adil understood that true strength lay in maintaining inner peace, even when the outside world tried to disrupt it. By not reacting, by choosing calmness over anger, he had preserved his dignity and his sense of self-worth. Maya, meanwhile, found herself sitting on a bench in a quiet park, the events of the cafe replaying in her mind. She thought about her own behavior, how quickly she had resorted to insults, how much effort she had put into trying to provoke him. For the first time, she began to see the consequences of her actions not on him, but on herself. Her frustration, her anger, and her need to control the situation had left her feeling exhausted and unsettled. In contrast, the man she had insulted had walked away with calm confidence, unaffected and at peace. The contrast was striking, and it made her think. Back in his apartment, Adil's thoughts turned to the subtle lessons that life often provided in unexpected ways. He realized that every encounter, even brief ones, offered an opportunity for growth. Today's encounter had reminded him of the importance of patience, restraint, and self-control. It had reminded him that not every insult required a response, not every conflict required engagement, and not every situation required proving oneself. Sometimes the strongest response was silence. Sometimes the most powerful action was simply to walk away. Maya, still sitting in the park, began to reflect more deeply. She realized that her anger and aggression had not achieved anything. In fact, they had only revealed her own vulnerabilities. In contrast, Adil's calmness had not only preserved his dignity, but had also left a lasting impression on those who had witnessed it. She thought about the people in the cafe who had glanced at him with admiration, and she began to understand that strength was not always loud or forceful. Strength could also be quiet, composed, and self-assured. As the evening approached, Adil prepared a light meal and settled in for the night. He felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that he had handled the day with composure and grace. The encounter at the cafe, though brief, had reinforced his belief that inner peace was far more valuable than temporary victories or the satisfaction of engaging in conflict. By choosing not to react, he had maintained control over his own emotions and had avoided unnecessary tension. He reflected on the idea that life often presented challenges not to defeat us, but to teach us about our own strength and resilience. Maya, on the other hand, returned home with her mind full of thoughts. She realized that the encounter had sparked a change within her, a new awareness of how her words and actions affected not only others, but also herself. She thought about the calm man who had walked away, unaffected by her words, and she felt a mix of frustration, curiosity, and admiration. For the first time, she considered that perhaps restraint and thoughtfulness could be more powerful than aggression. The next morning, Adil woke up feeling refreshed and calm. The events of the previous day had left a lingering sense of satisfaction. He went about his routine with a renewed appreciation for patience and self-control. He understood that life would continue to present challenges and that people would continue to test him in various ways. Yet, he felt confident that by maintaining his composure, he could navigate any situation without losing his sense of peace. Maya, meanwhile, began to notice subtle changes in herself. She realized that she had been quick to judge and quick to attack in the past, often without thinking about the consequences. The encounter with Adil had made her pause and reflect. She found herself questioning her usual approach to conflict and considering a different path, one that involved thoughtfulness, patience, and perhaps even humility. It was a small shift, but it was meaningful, and it would shape how she interacted with others in the future. Throughout the city, life continued its usual rhythm. People moved through the streets, shops opened and closed, and conversations filled the air. Yet, within this ordinary flow, both Adil and Maya carried the lessons of the previous day. One had experienced the quiet strength of restraint firsthand, while the other had begun to recognize the impact of her own actions. Both had been changed in subtle but important ways, demonstrating that even brief encounters could have lasting effects. As evening fell and the city lights began to glow, Adil reflected on the day's events once more. He understood that the cafe encounter was more than a simple exchange of words. It was a reminder of the power of composure, patience, and dignity. By refusing to engage in negativity, he had preserved his inner peace and demonstrated that true strength often lies in calmness, not confrontation. Maya, in her own way, was also reflecting on the power of calmness. She thought about how she had learned, perhaps without even realizing it, that her usual approach to conflict could be re-examined. She understood that strength could take many forms, and that sometimes the most effective way to influence others was not through words or aggression, but through quiet presence and composure. By the end of the evening, both Adil and Maya had been touched by the same encounter, each in their own way. One had demonstrated the power of inner strength, while the other had begun to learn from it. The cafe incident, though brief, had become a turning point, a moment that would influence their thoughts, actions, and perspectives long after the day had ended. And sometimes, it was in these small, quiet moments that life taught its most valuable lessons. The next few days passed quietly for Adil, each one blending into the next with the gentle rhythm of ordinary life. He went to work, visited the cafe for his usual coffee, and spent time in the small moments he cherished, reading, walking through the park, or simply observing life around him. The encounter at the cafe, though brief, lingered in his mind not as a source of stress, but as a subtle reminder of the power of calmness and self-control. He realized that in life, challenges and conflicts were inevitable, but how one responded to them made all the difference. Maintaining peace and composure could influence situations more than aggression ever could. Meanwhile, Maya could not stop thinking about the calm man who had refused to engage with her insults. At first, she had felt frustrated and even embarrassed that she had not provoked a reaction. But over the next few days, reflection began to take hold. She remembered the way Adil had stood quietly, how he had maintained dignity without uttering a single angry word, and how his simple act of walking away had been more powerful than any heated argument. She began to realize that true strength was often quiet, patient, and composed. This insight unsettled her in the best possible way. Adil's life continued, undisturbed by the incident, yet he remained aware of the lessons it had reinforced. He noticed small things in everyday interactions, the impatience of strangers in queues, the sharp words exchanged in offices, or the frustration expressed in minor disagreements. In each case, he reminded himself that he had the power to remain unaffected, to choose calmness over reaction, and to respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. He understood that people often acted out of their own frustrations, and that by refusing to participate in conflict, he could preserve his own peace and even influence the energy of those around him. Maya, in her daily life, began to notice her own changes. She caught herself thinking twice before making a sharp comment or trying to provoke someone. It was not easy at first. Old habits die slowly. But each time she paused and considered her words, she felt a small sense of pride. She realized that walking away, listening calmly, or choosing not to respond could sometimes have a stronger impact than confrontation. The memory of Adil's calm demeanor became a reference point for her behavior, a quiet guide encouraging her to rethink her approach to others. One afternoon, Maya returned to the same cafe, hoping to see him again. She did not know exactly why. Perhaps to witness his calm presence once more, or perhaps to understand the quiet confidence he had displayed. When she entered, she scanned the room and saw him in his usual corner by the window, reading quietly and sipping his coffee. She paused, almost hesitant, as she realized that the effect he had on her was deeper than mere curiosity. She admired his composure, the way he navigated life without letting negativity disturb his peace, and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. Adil noticed her glance but did not react beyond a polite nod. He understood that people observed, judged, and reflected in their own ways. He remained focused on his coffee and his book, unshaken by attention or curiosity. His calmness was not performative. It was a natural part of who he was. For Adil, the important thing was not to impress others, but to maintain his own sense of peace and integrity. He knew that genuine strength was not about seeking recognition, but about remaining composed in the face of challenge and negativity. Maya sat at a nearby table, quietly observing him. She reflected on the lessons she had begun to learn since their first encounter. Anger, sharp words, and confrontation often created tension, resentment, or regret. Calmness, patience, and self-control, on the other hand, commanded respect without raising a voice. She realized that her approach to life and people could change for the better if she embraced the power of reflection and restraint. It was a slow transformation, but meaningful in its depth and impact. Over the next few weeks, both Adil and Maya continued their routines, yet the encounter remained a subtle influence in their lives. Adil's calmness continued to guide his interactions with others, and people around him, whether colleagues, neighbors, or strangers, often noted the quiet strength he carried. He rarely needed to speak loudly or defend himself because his composure communicated everything necessary. People naturally gravitated toward him, sensing his stability and thoughtful presence. Maya, in turn, found that her relationships and daily interactions began to improve as she practiced restraint and thoughtfulness. She realized that listening calmly, pausing before speaking, and choosing not to react hastily had a positive effect on her life and on those around her. The incident at the cafe had become a turning point, showing her that power and influence did not always come from force or sharp words. Instead, they could emerge from patience, understanding, and quiet confidence. Adil's influence, though subtle, had a ripple effect beyond the immediate encounter. People who had observed his behavior noticed the difference between reacting impulsively and responding thoughtfully. They began to reflect on their own choices in moments of tension, inspired by his example. In this way, a single act of composure had a lasting impact, not just on one person, but on a broader circle of people who valued dignity and patience over conflict. Maya eventually came to a deeper understanding of herself. She realized that confrontation was not the only way to assert herself, and that true strength often lay in calmness and quiet confidence. She learned to respect the power of composure, to appreciate the value of listening before reacting, and to understand that not every challenge required engagement. In embracing these lessons, she found herself growing into a more thoughtful and patient person. The story concluded not with a dramatic event or conflict, but with subtle, lasting change. Adil continued his life with the same calmness he had always carried, navigating challenges with patience and dignity. Maya, inspired by his example, began to transform her approach to others, learning that restraint could be more powerful than reaction. Both had been touched by a simple encounter in a cafe, yet the lessons they carried would continue to influence their lives long after the incident had passed. In the end, the experience reminded them, and anyone who might hear the story, that strength is often quiet, that dignity and composure matter more than winning arguments, and that sometimes the most powerful response is simply to remain calm, observe, and walk away with peace intact. Life, they realized, rewards those who choose. Patience over provocation, reflection over impulsiveness, and understanding over anger.